In this lecture, we're going to talk about aggregate supply. So you'll see here that I have the graph of what an aggregate supply curve looks like, and it's basically illustrating the amount of real GDP that is produced at different price levels. Now, one thing that you'll note is that it looks identical to the supply curve that we learned about in Chapter 3, where we were talking about just the supply of a particular good or service. So that supply curve sloped upward because of the fact that firms were going to increase the supply of the good or service based on the law of supply. This particular supply curve, the aggregate supply curve, slopes upward for different reasons. We're basically analyzing the amount of all goods and services that are produced and how that changes as the overall price level in the economy changes. So the reason why it's sloping upward is because of the effect of the profit margins when the prices change, not by relative price changes. Now, economists distinguish between what's called a short-run aggregate supply curve and a long-run aggregate supply curve. So we already know that aggregate supply represents the total amount of goods and services that are produced by all firms in the economy, and it's going to show the relationship or the quantity of real GDP that's produced at the different prevailing market prices. So in the short run, the aggregate supply curve slopes upward because of the fact that an increase in that price level means higher profit margins for the firm, so the firms are going to want to produce more goods and services. Now, the reason why their profit margins will increase in the short run is because we believe that production costs and capital are held constant in the short run. So what that means is that the cost of the resources to the firm are not going to immediately increase when the price of the final goods and services are increasing. A word that we use to describe this is what we call sticky prices. In other words, in the short run, the resource costs are sticky. They're not going to automatically change in the short run. So resource prices are sticky. In other words, for example, assume that you work for a firm that produces a good and inflation is occurring. So let's say the inflation rate was 10%, therefore the price of the goods and services that the firm is selling are rising 10%. Does your boss automatically give you a 10% raise? Absolutely not. In other words, your wages will adjust in the long run, but in the short run, your wages remain constant. So the prices are going up, but the resource cost of labor is staying the same. So that's why a firm will be willing to increase the supply in the short run because their profit margins will increase. The price that they're charging for the good is increasing while the cost of their resources remain constant. So here we see what your average short run aggregate supply curve is going to look like in the short run. Notice again that it is sloping upward, meaning that again, as the equilibrium price level in the economy is rising, notice that it's rising, the firm is willing to increase the quantity of output that it's producing because its profit margins will increase because in the short run, the cost of the resources remain constant. Now you'll also notice that the aggregate supply curve starts to get steeper, and that's going to occur once the firms start to reach the maximum level of output that they're able to produce in the short run. Remember, in the short run, firms still have a fixed amount of capital, so they can't just continue to increase their output indefinitely because of the fact that they're dealing with fixed capital. In other words, there's only so many machines, only so many factories, therefore only so much output that can actually be produced in the short run. So as firms reach full capacity, that's why the aggregate supply curve in the short run will get steeper and steeper. So suppose we see here that right here, this may be where the firms as a whole in the economy have reached full capacity. So it doesn't matter if the price levels continue to increase. In other words, they are incapable of increasing the supply past that because they're at full capacity. So again, we can clearly see that in the short run, the aggregate supply curve is going to be upward sloping because firms will be induced to increase the quantity that they sell due to the higher profit margins induced by the higher price level while the resource costs remain constant. However, in the long run, we know that everything is going to adjust. In other words, in the long run, the production cost, the cost of the resources will adjust. In other words, when there's inflation, eventually the cost of the resources, including labor, are going to adjust to that, and they also will increase. Therefore, we graph our long run aggregate supply curve as just a completely vertical line at whatever the potential level of real GDP is. And remember, potential GDP, in other words, this right here, potential level of real GDP, that's simply output at the natural rate of unemployment. In other words, you'll recall in the last chapter, we learned about inflation and unemployment rates, and we said that whenever there's cyclical unemployment, we have what's called a GDP gap, the difference between what the economy could be producing if there was full employment and then what we are actually producing simply because of the cyclical unemployment. So the potential level of real GDP is basically talking about when there is no GDP gap or you can think of it as no cyclical unemployment. So in other words, if we have full employment in the economy, meaning we're at the natural rate of unemployment, then we are producing the natural amount of output that's going to take place. And so that's where your long run aggregate supply curve would be graphed at whatever the output level is based on the natural rate of unemployment. So again, what we're talking about is where we intersect down here. That would be the potential level of real GDP if we were graphing our long run aggregate supply curve. Now, switching gears back to looking at the short run aggregate supply curve, we want to understand what are the factors that would cause aggregate supply to change. In other words, what are the non-price determinants of aggregate supply that actually cause our aggregate supply curve to shift? Remember, if we're just moving up along the aggregate supply curve, it's because the price level in the economy is changing, and so firms are willing to increase the quantity of goods that they're producing because of the higher profit margins. But if there's an actual change in the aggregate supply of goods and services, then that means one of the non-price determinants of aggregate supply has to be changing, which is why the entire curve would shift. So the three common non-price determinants of aggregate supply, you'll see I have listed right here. It's going to be if there's a change in the overall price of resources, if there are changes in technology, or if there's a change in expectations. So let's look at each one of those individually. So the first determinant of aggregate supply, I said, was the resource prices. And so we know resource prices are going to have a major impact on aggregate supply of goods and services. So let's say we start out with aggregate supply like so. We have the price level over here. We have real GDP here. And let's say, for example, that there's an increase in the price of resources. So again, let's say resource prices increase. So we can be talking about something like oil. In other words, let's say that for whatever reason, the price of oil suddenly increases. So all the firms are having to pay more for their oil in the production process. And oil is usually a good example because oil is used in the production of most goods and services, if not in the actual production process, in transporting the goods to be sold. So if there was suddenly a huge spike in oil prices, what that would would do is actually cause firms overall to decrease the quantity that they produce at every price level. In other words, we know that each point along this aggregate supply curve represents the supply that will be supplied in the economy at a different price level. So what we're basically saying is that if the price of oil increases, then the amount that each firm is willing to supply at every price level is going to be declining like so. So it's shifting over, and that is why our entire aggregate supply curve would be shifting to the left. So anytime resource prices increase, that's going to cause aggregate supply to decrease, which is going to cause a leftward shift of the aggregate supply curve. And then, of course, the opposite occurs if the resource prices are falling. Let's say that resource prices are declining. So let's say the price of oil is dropping, then that's going to have the opposite effect. Firms are then going to increase the quantity they produce at every price level, and your aggregate supply curve would be increasing and it would be shifting to the right. So of course we know shift to the right means it'd be shifting this direction here. Now, the second non-price determinant of supply would be the existence of new emerging technology in the market. So again, we know any time that there is new technology, what that is effectively doing is allowing firms to increase the amount of output that they produce, and so that's going to cause aggregate supply to increase. In other words, firms are not going to invest in new technology if it's going to make them less productive. In other words, the point of new technology is to make firms more productive. So technological innovations, again, allow businesses to increase their productivity with their existing resources. So again, we just look at the graph like so. Anytime there's new technology, it's going to cause an increase in aggregate supply. So your aggregate supply curve is going to be shifting to the right. And then the third non-price determinant of aggregate supply is simply the expectations of the firm. And so let's use the expectations of like inflation rate as what we're talking about here. Let me draw my graph real quick. So again, here's our aggregate supply curve. And so let's say, for example, that we're talking about expectations of again, what the employees and employers expect the future price levels to be in the future. So most jobs are going to negotiate, employers are going to negotiate their wages based on what they think the future price level is going to be. So let's say, for example, that employees expect that the price level to be increasing, and they're able to negotiate with their firm for higher wages based on that expectation of higher price levels. So if that occurs, but then price levels don't go up, then what that means is that the cost of labor went up, which is a resource cost. So that would actually effectively cause aggregate supply to decrease. And of course, vice versa. Think about it, if the employees did not increase their wages, weren't able to negotiate higher wages, we know that's what would induce firms to increase their aggregate supply in the short run because of the higher profit margins brought on by the, if there's a higher price level. But again, if the firms are just negotiating increases in wages for their employees, however, those price levels don't go up, then the price level remains constant. The firm is paying more for their resources, which is why your aggregate supply curve would decrease like so. So again, the expectations of the firm can actually cause aggregate supply to change. Again, anticipated higher prices will cause the aggregate supply to decrease, whereas conversely, anticipated lower price levels cause aggregate supply to increase. So, of course, what's interesting about this is that just simply the expectation of price level changes shifting the aggregate supply actually bring about the price level changes. So of course, just to recap, any time one of those three non-price determinants of aggregate supply changes, so if the cost of resources are changing, if there's new technology, or if the expectations are changing, that can effectively act to shift the aggregate supply curve, therefore change aggregate supply at every price level. All right, now let's get some practice. Now that we've talked extensively about both aggregate demand and aggregate supply, let's put them together to see how non-price determinants changing can alter the equilibrium level of real GDP and the price level in the economy. So you'll notice on my first scenario I have here listed is, let's say, for examples, consumers expect a recession. So the first thing that we want to identify is that a non-price determinant of aggregate demand or a non-price determinant of aggregate supply. So we know that a consumer expectation, that's going to impact consumption spending, so that is a non-price determinant of aggregate demand. So what that would effectively do is shift the aggregate demand curve down like so. There would be a decrease in aggregate demand. And so we can see what happens in the economy when that occurs. It's going to drive the price level in the economy down, while at the same time decreasing the level of equilibrium real GDP. So if aggregate demand is decreasing due to a change in consumer expectations, it will push the economy into a recession. In other words, real GDP will fall, and at the same time we will probably start to see unemployment rates go up. All right, you'll notice that the second scenario I have listed here says workers expect higher future inflation and negotiate higher wages now. So again, if that were to occur, then that means the resource costs for the firms are increasing. Therefore, we know that's a non-determinate determinant of supply. So in other words, our aggregate supply curve would be shifting like so, because the cost of labor is increasing in the short run. And so again, we see that it's causing the economy to go into a recession because real GDP is going to fall. At the same time, it's causing the price level to rise. So you remember that we called that cost push inflation, when the cost of resources are what is pushing the price levels up in the economy. So in this case, the resource of labor price is increasing and it's pushing price levels up. The third scenario I have listed here is that it says technological improvements increase productivity. So again, remember that if there's new technology emerging and it's causing firms to become more productive, that's a non-price determinant of aggregate supply. So that would cause aggregate supply of goods and services to increase like so. So if that's occurring, then we should see an increase in real GDP. So that's going to trigger the expansionary phase of the business cycle because real GDP is increasing. Unemployment rates should be going down, and at the same time, it should effectively cause price levels in the economy to decline. So again, if there's new technology, then it's going to increase aggregate supply, push us into the expansionary phase, and then cause price levels to drop. All right, the next scenario I have listed is foreign income rises. And you recall that foreign income, that is something that will impact our net exports. And so net exports, that is going to impact aggregate demand for goods and services. So if foreign income is rising, what we believe is that there will be an increase in exported goods. In other words, if the income of our trading partners is going up, then that means that they're going to buy more of our goods and services. So if exports is going up, that also means net exports will increase. Because remember, net exports is simply exports minus imports. So if the amount of exports that we have is going up, then the value of net exports is going to rise. So if net exports is increasing, what that should do is increase the aggregate demand for goods and services in the economy. So aggregate demand will be increasing like so. And so we see that that should trigger the expansionary phase. In other words, real GDP is going to rise, and at the same time, It's also going to cause the price level in the economy to rise, which again we learned that is called demand pull inflation. When there's an increase in demand for goods and services, that's what's pulling the price up. So it's demand pull inflation that's going on here in the economy. Okay, and then the last scenario I have listed here is government spending increases. So we know government spending is a non-price determinant of aggregate demand, and so if the government starts to increase their expenditures for whatever reason, what that will do is effectively increase the overall aggregate demand for goods and services. So your aggregate demand curve would be shifting like so. So again, we see the same impact on real GDP as we just saw as foreign income rises. There should be an increase in real GDP, so we trigger the expansionary phase of the business cycle, and at the same time, that increase in demand for goods and services from the government will cause the price levels to rise. So again, we still see the demand pull inflation taking place.